Okay, ladies and gentlemen, could I ask you to please find a seat? So a couple of admin instructions before we begin our first panel. Within each of your packets, you have some 3x5 cards and a pen. They're for your use and note-taking as you desire. I would prod you a little bit to use a note card and kind of maybe put your thoughts down as the speakers go to help us move the questioning along. We want to get the wisdom of these three great scholars. So when we turn it back over to question and answer, remember microphone close enough where we can hear you, because this is being recorded on C-SPAN and on VMI's network. So I ask for your help in that endeavor. Now, I'm very honored to introduce the first panel. Vietnam War has generated some broad scholarship across the spectrum of topics, especially on the political and strategic direction of the war. The American public's perception of the war has been shaped by two broad interpretations: the traditional or orthodox view and the revisionist school. The traditional interpretation of the war largely holds that America was mistaken to intervene in Vietnam and predestined to fail. Essentially, the wrong war at the wrong time at the wrong place. Revisionists, however, countered that the war was necessarily waged against an enemy of hardened communists, who were also nationalists, and was winnable, although serious mistakes were made during the conduct of the war. Our first panel, Fighting a Multifaceted War, the American Perspective, will address elements of these interpretations. Our first panelist is Dr. Mark Moyar. Dr. Moyar is currently the director of the Office for Civilian-Military Cooperation at USAID, where he has served since February 2018. Previously, he was director of the Project on Military and Diplomatic History at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is an expert in special operations and has worked as a consultant for the senior leadership of Joint Special Operations Task Force Afghanistan and the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. He has held the Kim T. Adamson Chair of Insurgency and Terrorism at the Marine Corps University and served as Senior Fellow at the Joint Special Operations University in Tampa, Florida. Dr. Moyar is a prolific writer, and among his notable works is the major revisionist account of the war, Triumph Forsaken, the Vietnam War, 1954-1965, which will serve as the basis of his remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Mark Moyar.
Thank you, Colonel Gray, for that warm introduction. Thanks also to you, Colonel Gray, and Major Connolly, and the rest of your staffs. Having spent some time organizing events like this, I realize the amount of time that goes into even just a one-day effort. So thanks to you for all your help and for making this happen. Thanks to the cadets for getting up at an early hour today to come here, and thanks to our veterans as well. So also want to thank my fellow panelists, Greg and Jackie, who are here, and looking forward to a terrific panel and day here. The Vietnam War has been and remains one of the most contentious and politicized historical subjects in this country. And you're going to hear about a variety of different aspects, and you already heard Senator Webb touch on and address some of the key controversies. For this panel, we're focused on American military strategy and strategic effectiveness. So I want to first talk about what I see as one of the key problems in the orthodox way of looking at the conflict. So journalists and historians, and by extension the American public, inclined to view the military side of the Vietnam War as one largely of continuity. And if you look at this interpretation of looking at the war, it's a prolonged guerrilla war that the United States was doomed to lose against a cunning enemy with superior resolve. And I would argue that this narrative overlooks some fundamental changes in the war's dynamics over time, which are really fundamental to understanding the war. So one of the fundamental questions and ongoing points of dispute is exactly what type of war was this? Was it a counterinsurgency? Was it a conventional war against an invading force? Some people, such as the late Colonel Harry Summers, have said it was essentially a conventional war, invasion from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. There are others, most prominently Andrew Krapenovich and John Nagel, who said it was essentially a counterinsurgency, but one that the United States tried to fight as a conventional war. In my view, it began as a counterinsurgency, that turned into a blend of counterinsurgency and conventional warfare, and ended up as essentially a conventional war. And I'm going to talk about how it evolved. So the clash between the North and South begins in 1954 when South Vietnam was divided after the war between France and the Viet Minh. The new South Vietnamese president, Ngo Dinh Diem, uses armed force initially to consolidate his rule over some rebellious sects. The communists initially focus on political subversion, thinking that the government's too weak to stand. Over the intervening period, as the Diem regime is able to consolidate rule, the United States helps it develop new armed forces, and this is one of the early controversies on the military side. The U.S. encourages Diem to form a conventional force with 7 regular divisions. Critics will allege that really you didn't need a conventional force like this because you faced this guerrilla threat. You should have focused more on lightly armed militia units that could secure the population and deal with the guerrillas. Now, I disagree with that. I think if you look at the big picture, this was ultimately going to be a war decided by conventional arms. You don't defeat a country simply with guerrilla warfare, and you needed conventional forces to stop that, and we'll return to that theme in a bit. We also saw that, and for those of you who have followed more recent events, this is a recurring question, is can you actually get a regular army to fight in a counterinsurgency or counter-guerrilla setting? And I think you can. You have a lot of examples of conventional forces being broken down into small units to do patrolling and a lot of the other things a militia would do. It's also worth noting that President Diem of South Vietnam actually did create militia forces, and it was actually the United States which did not want to fund these heavily because our embassy thought that there wasn't a big threat at the time. The real problem, and the biggest takeaway, I think, is not the problem of organization that the South Vietnamese faced, but it was a problem of leadership because they were short on the human capital you are required to field effective armed forces. And this is something you can't just build overnight, and this is a theme I've actually looked at in many other historical cases, and we see this problem again and again when you try to create new armed forces but you don't have experienced leadership. And it will take South Vietnam about 7 years to develop the leadership they need. So they don't have it in time for the onset of the insurgency, which is in 1960, at which time the North Vietnamese have decided they need to resort to conventional war, to armed conflict to get what they want. And so they launch an insurgency similar to what Mao Zedong did in the Chinese Civil War. They infiltrate thousands of trained military and political officers into South Vietnam. They mobilize villagers and launch guerrilla attacks. And initially, the South Vietnamese government's response is ineffectual because it does not have the effective military or militia forces to deal with it. So that trend continues for 1960, 1961. In 1962, we see a major change in the situation where you see a new generation of leadership increasingly taking control. You also have greater U.S. support, President Kennedy increasing our support. And so you see greatly increased effectiveness on the part of the South Vietnamese allies. There's a new program called the Strategic Hamlets, which organize militias that help keep communists out of villages. And this trend will continue into 1963, and this is one of the periods of the war that I think has not gotten enough attention, but there's overwhelming evidence both from American sources and also now from what the North Vietnamese have said that in fact there was a major shift at this time. Now in 1963, the political situation changes and something called the Buddhist crisis erupts in South Vietnam. This is also another huge point of contention between historians. To what extent was this actually a reflection of legitimate political grievances versus trumped up charges which had communist inspiration behind them? I believe it closer to the latter. We do know there was some communist infiltration, a lot of false allegations. We can spend a lot of time talking about that, but interested in focusing on the military part, I'll say that South Vietnamese generals actually wanted the government to crack down on this. President Diem is caught in a difficult situation. The Americans think he should just conciliate this Buddhist, but when he does, there's simply more protests. Ultimately, the United States decides to support a military coup, thinking that this is going to lead to improved military situation, but in fact what happens is you have infighting among the generals, you have massive purges of people who are considered to be loyal to President Diem, and so the military situation actually deteriorates quite drastically. And the North Vietnamese are paying attention to this, they're following events, and they see here could be an opportunity. And then we have, shortly after Diem is killed in the coup, we have President Kennedy's killed, Lyndon Johnson comes in. In 1964, there's a presidential campaign, and Johnson sees it as advantageous to characterize himself as a peace candidate against the Barry Goldwater, the supposed warmonger, and who was talking tough about Vietnam. And so this also conveys to Hanoi a signal that, in fact, the South is ripe for the taking, and so in late 1964, just after Johnson is elected, Hanoi decides that they are going to go for broke. They're going to start sending entire North Vietnamese army divisions into South Vietnam and try to take over the South in 1965 before the Americans change their mind. And the period in early 1965 is actually a lot of large battles which have to some extent escape the historical record because they don't fit into this idea of this prolonged guerrilla conflict. But in fact, there are clearly a lot of major clashes between North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese. South Vietnamese take heavy losses, and this is really what leads to the decision to insert American troops. In June of 1965, General Westmoreland says that if we don't intervene with American forces, the South is soon going to fall. The Americans come in, they are able to stop the North Vietnamese before they can win decisively. There's some major clashes that go on during this period. The most famous of which is the Battle of Ia Drang Valley in November '65, immortalized in the movie We Were Soldiers. Then once this offensive has been blunted, there's a lot of controversy over how the U.S. military should proceed. Westmoreland orders his forces to concentrate on search and destroy operations, where they go try to locate enemy forces and destroy them, particularly in the mountains and jungles, before they can actually go into the populous areas to cause trouble. There's a lot of pushback from some people, both on the military and civilian side, who argue that this is too focused on the enemy military forces. The real contest is in the population centers where the hearts and minds of people are to be won, and that you can deal with these enemy units when they show up. There's a Marine program created called the Strategic called the Combined Action Program, where they take small Marine and militia units together to conduct population security. And so some people view this as sort of the strategy we should have done on a large scale. We never really did it to scale. I tend to disagree with that critique. I think, again, in the big picture, you did need the large conventional forces to deal with the enemy force, and you're, generally speaking, fared better when you tried to get them before they chose the time and place of the fighting. These little counter-guerrilla units we've seen, including combined action platoons, would easily and did get overrun when confronted with superior force. Another argument that Westmoreland made as to why he didn't have the U.S. military involved in the villages was that the South Vietnamese know the people, they know the language, they can deal with them better, and I think that's actually a pretty compelling point. Westmoreland also faulted heavily for the so-called body count, where they measured progress based on enemy casualties, and there's certainly some evidence of inflation, although I think, as Senator Webb mentioned, it not to the extent that I think sometimes people thought. And also in this type of conflict, it does matter how many forces the enemy have. So if you whittle them down from 3 divisions to 2 divisions, that is going to make a difference. In terms of the loyalty of the population, and there was a question raised on this earlier, and it's a recurring theme, it was a significant factor, I would say, because among other things, you have to recruit from the population to get people on your side. For a while, the communists did have the edge on this, especially in the period after the 1963 coup. But by the late 60s, the South Vietnamese government has recovered and actually is far out recruiting the North Vietnamese. And so ultimately, it's more of a question of a contest between North and South. And we see by the 65 massive infiltration from the North. And that leads to another strategic controversy in terms of how do we deal with this threat of massive North Vietnamese infiltration. And there's disputes over how important that is. There are, again, some who still think this is primarily an internal conflict. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff pick up on this fairly early and argue that until you address this problem of infiltration from the North, we are going to be fighting an endless war of attrition. So one idea that's proposed is invasion of North Vietnam, and clearly there were great military advantages you could get by that. Even if you don't completely destroy the enemy, you could take their ports, you could take population centers. Now, the reason why President Johnson didn't go forward with that, the primary reason is he feared that the Chinese would come in, which is basically what happened in the Korean War. So that's turned down. The other option that's proposed is sending troops in to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, which I think was a significantly lower risk, and we do know now that both the North Vietnamese and us, as well as the Soviets, think it could have been done with 3 to 5 American divisions, which is a lot less than what we put in. But those options were not taken until temporary incursion in 1971, by which time American forces were not involved and it wasn't as big as initially planned. Next big change in the phase of the war, the Tet Offensive, 1968, where the communists go in and they believe they're going to foment massive uprisings in the cities. Turns out the population is not supportive. They largely stick to themselves, and so the communists are isolated, and they don't have the advantage of being able to flee as they do typically, so they suffer crippling losses. And this event also galvanizes the South Vietnamese leadership, which then becomes increasingly aggressive. And in the period after Tet, we see very sharp gains in counterinsurgency and pacification. Great degradation of the communist capabilities to recruit in the South Vietnam. We also have in 1968, Creighton Abrams takes over from Westmoreland as commander of U.S. forces, and there's another debate about whether Abrams made a huge difference, whether he had a much better approach than Westmoreland. I tend to think the change was not that pronounced, and that Abrams actually still did a lot of the search and destroy options. He also was in a different situation than Westmoreland had been. So there are some differences, but I don't see it as a key change. I'll just touch briefly on the last phases of the war. Spring of 1972, there's a massive North Vietnamese invasion of the South. And by this time, there's no U.S. forces on the ground, but we have advisors and air power, and that offensive is decisively defeated and provides compelling evidence of, in fact, how much better the South Vietnamese armed forces have become. And as the U.S. withdraws in early 1973, President Nixon promises the South Vietnamese that we will, in fact, come back if there is another major violation. And I think we don't know for sure what Nixon would have done had it not been for Watergate, but clearly, because of Watergate and the opinion in Congress, aid to South Vietnam gets cut. Our air power is no longer to be used in the South. So 1975, North Vietnam, they're still not 100% sure what's going to happen, so they attack one of the provincial capitals, and then they see that there is not a forceful U.S. response, and they then move forward with this massive offensive, and the South Vietnamese don't have the military supplies, equipment left because of the aid cuts to contend with this, and so they are defeated. So I just will, in summation, just mention a few points to reiterate. Find that usually a successful speech, you can get 3 key points across. And this audience looks pretty promising, so I'm going to go with 4 points, and hopefully we'll get there. And for those who started nodding off, now is the time to pay attention. So the first point I would make is that the Vietnam War started as an insurgency and turned into a mixture of insurgency and conventional war, and then ended as a conventional war. Second point, the search and destroy tactics and the body count were not mindless, and nor were they leading cause of the inability of the United States to achieve its objectives. The third thing I would say is that there was a fundamental strategic error in America's failure to address the problem of North Vietnamese infiltration on the Ho Chi Minh Trail on the ground. We did bomb it, I should say, but we didn't go after it on the ground. And then the last point I would make is that the United States, I think, could have kept South Vietnam intact had it been willing to maintain its air aid and its air support after 1972. So thank you very much. Look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Moyar. Our next panelist is Dr. Gregory Dadis. He is an associate professor of history and director of Chapman University's master's program in war and society. Prior to that, he served as chief of the American History Division in the Department of History at West Point. A retired U.S. Army colonel, he's had service in both Operations Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom. He specializes in the history of the Vietnam Wars and the Cold War era, and he's author of several books on the Vietnam War, including Westmoreland's War, Reassessing American Strategy in Vietnam, which he will address some of those comments for today. Dr. Dadis.
Good morning. Thanks for coming out. I really appreciate it. General P, and thank you to both you and your wife for hosting us here in Lexington. Dave, thanks for the invitation, and to Kim Conley, thank you for having us. And most importantly, I want to thank whoever was responsible for the chicken and waffles at the reception last night, because they were amazing. Pierre, you missed out. I can't handle 3 or 4 points, so I'm going to stick to just one. And here's what I'd like you to do this morning, is to reconsider likely how you think about American strategy in the Vietnam War. Because if there is one word that is most associated with the American strategy in Vietnam, it is attrition. So critics of the war maintain that General William C. Westmoreland, who was commander of the U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, I'll try and keep my acronyms light this morning, prosecuted this ground campaign in South Vietnam in the 1960s, and by doing so, he employed this flawed strategy of attrition, and he concentrated at the expense of all other missions on killing enemy soldiers. And the argument goes that he's hypnotized by body counts. He's hypnotized by search and destroy missions, and officers like Westmoreland led the U.S. Army to failure in Vietnam because they never realized that insurgency warfare required basic changes in Army methods to meet the exigencies of this new conflict. And so these detractors of American strategy in Vietnam argue if only he had employed a better strategy, focusing on countering the southern insurgency rather than the northern conventional threat, Americans had or could have achieved victory. In fact, one senior officer, superintendent at West Point, who clearly was not as smart as the superintendent here at VMI, argued, I gotta make sure I'm taking care of my hosts here, argued that attrition in Vietnam was actually an absence of strategy. So think about this for a moment. Here's a senior officer in the United States Army arguing that that army had no strategy at all in Vietnam. But I think there are problems with his criticisms. In fact, William Westmoreland did have a strategy. But it did not countenance an exclusive policy of attrition focused only on killing enemy soldiers. And in fact, words like attrition, if not words like strategy, which Jackie's going to talk in more detail about after it seems to have been misunderstood not just by contemporary critics, but also, I would argue, by more recent historians. MACV and its commander certainly used the word attrition, but I would argue to do more so to express his belief that victory in Vietnam was not going to be achieved quickly. So here's my thesis. So if you're writing this down, cadets, instead of watching ESPN on your laptops, which I'm sure you're not doing. My argument this morning is that Westmoreland actually had a very comprehensive approach to this problem in Vietnam, and it was a realistic strategy. It recognized the complex nature of the threat that was both unconventional and conventional, as Mark just talked about, but I would argue more importantly was just as much political as it was military. And neither counterinsurgency alone or a singular focus on conventional combat operations was going to position the American forces any closer to victory, a point I think that was well understood by MACV's commander. So what I'm suggesting here is that the United States' failure in Vietnam had less to do with commanders choosing a correct or incorrect strategy than it did with the inability of foreign forces to resolve intractable problems within South Vietnam's government and society. Now I want to be careful here because I'm not placing blame on the Saigon government or its political community. But what I feel has happened here in Vietnam was the Saigon government was never able to fashion and then articulate an ideal of Vietnamese nationalism that was shared and accepted by the bulk of the South Vietnamese population. And in the civil war over Vietnamese national identity in the modern era, there were simply some questions that foreigners from the United States could not answer. In my opinion, this American faith in the power to reconstruct, if not create, South Vietnamese political communities and a larger holistic political community in South Vietnam led to policies which never fully addressed the fundamental issue, which was the struggle to define Vietnamese nationalism and identity in the modern age. So not only had American political and military leaders overestimated their ability to bend North Vietnam to their will, but they also overestimated, I would think most importantly, their ability to help build a political community overseas. And for the cadets in the room this morning, I think this is one of the most important perspectives to be gained from studying this conflict. And to wrestle with the uncomfortable proposition and possibility that the capacity for Americans to reshape, if not create, new political and social communities overseas can only achieve so much. To wrestle with the proposition, as uncomfortable as it is, that it is possible that there are limits to American power. Now, a basic pillar of the popular narrative on the American strategy in Vietnam rests on this contention that American officers didn't understand counterinsurgency in the early and mid-1960s. I don't think that's correct. As West Point superintendent from 1960 to 1963, Westmoreland instituted mandatory counterinsurgency training for all cadets. They studied the theoretical works of Mao Zedong and Vo Nguyen Xiao. They explored the histories of revolutionary struggles in the Philippines, in Malaya, in Indochina. And upon assumption of command in Vietnam, Westmoreland's mission was incredibly holistic. His objective was to create, or help create, along with his South Vietnamese allies, a stable and independent non-communist government in South Vietnam. Think about that mission for a moment. It is as much political as it is military. And it is a daunting objective. So Westmoreland had to create an all-encompassing strategic concept, one that was not only focused on destroying enemy forces, one that was focused not only on countering a local insurgency, but also helping expand the percentage of South Vietnamese population under the Saigon government's control. This is a large, large mission that the U.S. military forces in South Vietnam have been handed by their civilian policymakers. And Westmoreland understood this. Listen to what he writes to his commanders in 1965, late 1965. The war in Vietnam is a political as well as military war. It is political because the ultimate goal is to regain the loyalty and cooperation of the people. But think about that for a moment. How can foreign forces help regain the loyalty of the local population? Now, certainly Westmoreland used the word attrition in his memoirs, in his correspondence with his officers. But when you read his messages to subordinates or the Pentagon or even to the White House, these messages suggest that the general was focused less on killing, attriting the enemy, and more on intimating to those directing to the war effort that this conflict in Vietnam, it was not going to be concluded in a swift manner. Attrition underlined the problems of fighting a protracted war. As he wrote to the Joint Chiefs in June of 1965, the premise behind whatever further actions we may undertake must be that we are in for the long pull. This struggle has become a war of attrition. I see no likelihood in achieving a quick, favorable end to the war. And as his chief intelligence officer recalled, Westmoreland had not one battle to fight but three. First, to contain the growing conventional threat. Second, to develop the Republic of Vietnam's armed forces. And third, to pacify and protect the peasants in the South Vietnamese countryside. So what Westmoreland creates is a multifaceted strategy to achieve these objectives. Three phases he has. One, to commit U.S. and allied forces necessary to halt the losing trend. And once that losing trend has been halted, then to resume the offensive. But it's not just a military offensive, it's also a political one. And then finally, to oversee the defeat and destruction of the remaining forces. Again, not just militarily, but also politically. It is a three-phased, sustained campaign. And it has a multitude of subordinate military and political tasks. The problem, I think, is that what Westmoreland lacked, as did the entire U.S. Army, I think, during the Vietnam War, was a way to articulate these broad military concepts for such a complex environment like South Vietnam. This strategic problem is one of strategic articulation. In short, I would argue the military lexicon of the day was unsuited to the myriad tasks required of Westmoreland's command. So lacking precise terminology to describe all of these battles that MACV is fighting along with his South Vietnamese allies, the strategic concept came with the risk of ambiguity. And since then, we have become comfortable with cliches and tropes: search and destroy, body count, attrition. And while those words are useful for critics, I think they are unsatisfying for expressing the complexity of the tasks that the Americans and their South Vietnamese allies faced. Now, certainly there were problems of implementation with this strategy. It's very difficult to translate military success into military successes into political progress. And again, for the cadets in the room, I would ask you to consider this as tactical leaders. How do you translate your success on the tactical battlefield to political progress on the strategic battlefield? And certainly military operations oftentimes worked at odds with the larger political aims. Military operations often cause depopulation in the countryside, therefore contradicting the very American goals of developing a sense of political stability among the people. And oftentimes those tactical successes achieved only temporary results. But what's important here is that killing was never an end unto itself. Westmoreland always looked to follow combat operations immediately with pacification programs. His official report on the war held that pacification effort and the main force war were essentially inseparable. Opposite sides of the same coin, he said. And in short, he argued, much like the U.S. Army does today in its counterinsurgency doctrine, that only in a secure environment can pacification, the political progress, flourish. The problem, I would argue this morning, though, is that American military effectiveness, however effective it was, could not impose political constancy in Saigon or force either the South Vietnamese forces or perhaps more importantly the South Vietnamese population to view the central government as a legitimate political entity, one which could better combat the insurgent threat. In short, not all problems inside South Vietnam could be solved by American military might. Now, after the war, a narrative started to grow. And that narrative was based on two words: if only. If only Westmoreland had developed and implemented a better strategy, focused more on counterinsurgency and less on attriting enemy forces, the Americans could have been better placed to achieve victory. If only Westmoreland had fought a better war like his successor, Creighton Abrams, the United States would not have lost in Vietnam. And then those if only arguments proliferated after the war. If only the military had been allowed to widen the scope of the war. If only public support had remained strong. If only a resolute civilian leadership had been willing to see the war through. If only Jane Fonda had not gone to North Vietnam. Yet among the many military critics, the notion of a failed strategy remained at the heart of arguments of why the United States lost in Vietnam. And I would argue that these if-only arguments are simplistic and mistaken. Simplistic to the point of a 1 + 1 = 2 equation. One historian has described Westmoreland's strategy as mobility plus firepower equals attrition. Think about that. In one of the most complex, complicated wars of the 20th century, 1 + 1 = 2, that's how we explain the outcome. I would ask you all not to fall into that trap. MACV commander never relied on an attrition strategy, just as he never employed a counterinsurgency strategy. Summarizing any strategy in a complex war like this with one word seems fraught with imprecision at best, provocation and lies at worst. And one thing I'd like to leave you with is that in large sense, I think senior U.S. policymakers were asking too much of their military strategists. In the end, this was a war, a struggle between and among Vietnamese. And for the United States, the foundation on which American forces waged a struggle that involved both construction of an effective host government and destruction of a committed communist nationalist enemy proved too fragile. Officers like Westmoreland and Abrams after him found that nation building in a time of war was one of the most difficult tasks you can ask of a military force. Yet our faith in the power to reconstruct, if not create, political communities abroad led to policies which I would argue did not address the fundamental issue, which was the internal contest to define and come to a consensus on Vietnamese nationalism and identity in the modern age. And so if there is perspective to be gained from the long American experience in Vietnam, and Southeast Asia as a whole, it arguably lies here. Not all problems can be solved by military force, even when that force is combined with political and economic and social efforts. The capacity of Americans to reshape new and political, social communities may not, in fact, be limitless. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Daddis. Dr. Jacqueline Whitt will be our third panelist. Dr. Whitt is Associate Professor of Strategy in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College. She teaches courses on the theory of war and national security policy and strategy, American war, society, and social change, and great books for senior leaders. She has taught military history, American history, and the history of world religions at the United States Military Academy, and was also a faculty member on the Department of Strategy at the Air War College. Her areas of academic specialization include war and religion, social and cultural approaches to the study of war, military chaplaincy, the Vietnam War, war since 1945, and contemporary American military history. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Jackie Whitt.
Hi, good morning. First, I'd like to follow my fellow panelists in thanking the folks here at VMI, Colonel Gray, Major Connolly, General P, and your wife. Thank you so much for inviting us. I also have to start by saying that as a current employee of Uncle Sam, my remarks today are my own and do not reflect the official views of the U.S. Army War College, the Department of Defense, or the United States government. Mark and Greg have done, I think, a really nice job of setting us up to take a more critical look at American military strategy in Vietnam. They've asked us to examine assumptions about pivotal moments in the history of that war and to think carefully about how our assumptions and how what we know to simply be true might affect how we understand what happened. I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack, and I'm going to try to complicate the sort of divide between orthodox and revisionist interpretations that Colonel Gray laid out for us in his opening remarks. Rather than reappraising American strategy in Vietnam, as such, I'd like to use my time this morning to take a sort of step back and to think about how we understand the history of the war in Vietnam in the broader context of American grand strategy and American identity. I think we have to think about how we understand what Vietnam means to us as Americans, as well as to understand what happened. So I approach this question as both a historian of the Vietnam War, a historian of American military strategy, of American grand strategy, but also as someone who, in my day-to-day life, teaches something called strategy to American military officers, to senior officers, American and international, and to our interagency civilians. So my vantage point sort of straddles the contemporary with the historical. And even still, the specter of Vietnam, the legacy of Vietnam, looms large in classrooms, in briefing rooms. It looms large in the collective popular and political imaginations of Americans, for sure. And we collectively, scholars, the public, veterans, still don't agree about what happened in Vietnam, and we certainly don't agree on what it means, on the interpretations of that. But our own readings and understandings of exactly what happened and what it means continue to shape how we approach contemporary questions about strategy, policy, and American military interventions abroad. So after all, here we are 50 years after 1968, and we're still asking what seem to be sort of basic questions. Why did the United States lose in Vietnam, or why did it fail to achieve its political objectives? And then why does that matter? And on the first, we still wrestle with a host of important and competing arguments. We've already seen some of these this morning. whether that's strategic failure, misunderstanding the nature of the war, not having the right force, not fighting the right war at the right time, examinations of political and military leadership. We can talk about counterinsurgency, air power, the media, Vietnamization. We might, I think later this morning, we'll get to what the Vietnamese themselves had to do with it, which I think is an important piece. And all of these add to a rich and complex understanding of the American war in Vietnam. But I think I also want to talk a little bit about popular narratives of the war and how these coalesce around the idea that the war was a military victory but a political defeat for the United States, and that political defeat was suffered largely at home. And this particular narrative, this again political or military victory but political defeat, has several flavors. And if you want a sampling of that, you can turn to the World Wide Web, to the internet, or to a sort of common average undergraduate classroom to find these. So we have several flavors. The first one might be that American protesters, the anti-war movement, gave comfort to the enemy, right? That by 1968, the Viet Cong was sort of on its heels. The Tet Offensive was not a great victory, but that when Giap and others saw the protests in the United States, saw the anti-war movement, that gave them sort of the will and the resolve to continue the fight, and they did so. There is, of course, a media-centric argument. On the internet, again, if you Google the question, why did the U.S. lose in Vietnam? One very popular answer says only the following, and this is a quote. It says ABC, CBS, NBC, and the New York Times. And that's the answer. There's another one that goes something, it's about the communists, right, in the United States. Another popular answer says this, and another quotation: the only answer to this, why did the U.S. lose in Vietnam, is that the U.S. didn't lose. The politicians forced a withdrawal on us. The U.S. was betrayed by a left-wing media and by communists, there's a expletive there, such as Jane Fonda. We lost because the frickin' communist traitors here in the U.S. forced it on us. There's a more reasonable sounding political pressure bent. Quote, militarily, the U.S. was never beaten in a large-scale battle. The USA withdrew from Vietnam due to domestic political pressure over the morality and casualty rates in the war. The USA lost because they did not have the political will to finish the job. And the final sort of flavor, and again, this is all over, and I'm sure you hear these and you know these. You may think some of these have some credence. Another one says, we lost in Vietnam because there was no support. We won World War II because everyone pitched in. In Vietnam, everyone was against it. And this one ends with like a little sad face. And so in the public imagination, the conclusion is pretty clear and enthusiastic. Those damn hippies lost us the war. But I think this narrative of military victory, we were winning when I left, things were going okay, and political defeat is both persistent and pervasive, even as the scholarly community, even though those of us who study the war have sort of moved away from these blunt arguments. Nevertheless, the idea is that the United States lost the war in Vietnam because it lacked support at home, and that holds. But I think the story is incorrect and insidious. The myth, of course, develops before the war even ends. It comes about, it's ushered in before the war comes to a close, in part by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. It cements itself in the midst of the culture wars of 1980s and 1990s, as we get laments about American decline, the problems of the hollow army, when we vowed to defeat the Vietnam syndrome once and for all, when we showcase American firepower and technology as a solution to winning the nation's wars in, say, the first Gulf War. The myth resurfaces then in the mid to late 2000s as the United States fights in increasingly frustrating wars against insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan. Supporters of these efforts call on the legacy of Vietnam, and especially on the treatment of veterans of that war, to cast any doubt about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as unpatriotic, as supporting the troops becomes a central rallying cry for Americans in this post 9/11 world. Americans are told that fighting these kinds of wars requires both military expertise, and by God, we're getting better at it, and the political will to win. And so here we are, again, 50 years gone. But the consequences of this narrative, I think, are twofold. First, it perpetuates an American-centric view of the war and its outcome, and this gets to some of the things that Greg talked about. The story invites us to ask these perpetual what-if questions over and over again. The Vietnamese side of the war is almost entirely absent from the discussion, not to mention the host of other global players on the stage. The second consequence, though, to me is more troubling as someone who teaches strategy. It allows us to avoid real and hard questions about the failure of strategy and the political limits to the use of force. Because this narrative of military victory, and if it's true that political defeat, then there's a pretty clear roadmap for future contests. Excel militarily at tactical and operational levels, maintain public support, have a clear goal in mind, and win wars. And I think this enables a sort of too easy conclusion about how wars are fought and how wars are won. It leaves us to conclusions that say things like we ought to just leave war to the generals. It leads questions about the principle of civilian control of the military and the necessity of aligning military strategy to political objectives. The narrative of military victory and political defeat sidesteps a critical examination of how and when military power ought to be employed in service of national strategy. Most importantly, this narrative ignores the fact that political limits are real limits. Political losses are still losses. To say that the war was a military victory and a political defeat is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of strategy and the nature of winning and losing wars. And it is to misunderstand that both in a general sense, but it also prevents us from really understanding the complexities and the consequences of this war in particular. And we know that the complexities and the consequences of this war in particular are deeply important. So I want to take you back to my day job, and I don't know if any of you are Army War College graduates, but perhaps we can talk about how and why things change in those institutions as well. Vietnam still looms large in the study and practice of American military strategy and policy, because the war still reverberates. We are still rehashing what went wrong in Vietnam every time we talk about Iraq and Afghanistan. We are still fighting with an all-volunteer force. We have a different idea today about what the Guard and Reserve bring to the table. We still don't know what happened or exactly why, and we still don't agree on why it matters. And so the Vietnam War remains with us. So one of the things that my colleagues and I have done at the Air War College and now at the Army War College is to go back to Vietnam and to use Vietnam as a case study for strategy and for decision making. And we've designed a sort of experiential exercise. Actually, Greg and Mark have seen sort of versions of this, and Pierre, who we'll hear from later today. And we give War College students the chance to sort of turn back the clock and try again. We ask them to read a series of documents, of primary sources. We hand them a stack of reference materials, intelligence reports and estimates, political reports, some documents from the North Vietnamese and from the South Vietnamese as well. And we give them the same simple political guidance that sort of held in 1965. Maintain an independent, non-communist South Vietnam. And we ask for a strategy. And we tell them that complete withdrawal, just cutting and running, getting out, isn't really an option. And so we ask them to operate within the confines, within the political, military, economic confines of what was known in 1965 and within the constraints of the time. And the problem is that I've yet to see a good answer to this question. To be fair, we only give them a couple of hours to work. And they only have, and then none of them are sort of experts in the Vietnam War. Nonetheless, their solutions, the briefings that they give us at the end, fall out pretty predictably. And it's remarkably easy for faculty members to sit there and sort of ask questions and poke holes in almost anything they devise. We can tell you probably within 30 seconds why whatever it is that they're suggesting probably isn't going to work. Most groups suggest some version of what the U.S. actually tried under William Westmoreland. And this always actually surprises them, and it upsets them a little, because they don't want to think that maybe William Westmoreland, who they've heard much about, maybe did the same thing that they might have tried. Others want to try to transplant the surge from Iraq in 2007 and 2008 to Vietnam in 1965. Others are intent to use more firepower, more combat troops, to escalate air power. Maybe we'll try Operation Linebacker a little bit early. Maybe we'll go ahead and bomb Hanoi. Maybe we'll go ahead and go into Laos and Cambodia earlier. Others say they want more troops for pacification, for population-centric counterinsurgency. They say, sure, we'll stay for decades if we have to. We'll train the ARVN better. We'll be more precise. We won't commit atrocities. We'll have a better understanding of Vietnamese language and history and culture. We'll fight it better. We'll do it better this time. But then we start asking those same questions, right? Where are you going to get the extra divisions from? You're going to pull them out of West Germany? What's that going to do with the relationship with the Soviet Union? How is that going to affect your relationship with China? Will the thing you are proposing have the desired political effect? Is it politically wise or even feasible to call up part of the reserve component? Are you sure Americans can train and pacify? Are you sure the South Vietnamese government can be stabilized? Are you sure that knowing the language and the culture can actually turn the tide of the war? What if it's the very presence of U.S. troops that's the problem? And man, we're really depressed by the time we leave this session. We always need to go to a bar and have some beers, because it becomes abundantly clear that there were few, maybe no decent options, and that these options narrowed with every passing day and every decision that got made. And when we put the Vietnam War, the American war in Vietnam, if we embed it deeply within the broader strategic construct of the Cold War, then we start talking about issues like American credibility and resolve and reputation, regional stability and regional dynamics. We have to start thinking about the alliance system and the security assurances and military interventions that underpin American grand strategy in the Cold War. And it starts to look more and more that the American war in Vietnam could not be won, but also perhaps that it was one that we had to fight. It could be that no amount of fighting was going to make it better or was going to bring about a political victory. But that doesn't mean that the option of withdrawing or going home or staying out was a viable one either, at least not by the 1960s. If you're familiar with Harry Potter and the idea of time turners, right? If we're turning back time, we have to go far, far further back. Maybe to 1963, maybe to 1954, maybe to 1945, maybe to 1919. And so when we talk then about what it might mean for the military to be sent to fight a fundamentally unwinnable war, an unwinnable war with perhaps muddled and changing political ends. What's it like to be sent to confront a problem at enormous cost and with very real risk to life and limb, but a problem that must be managed, that maybe cannot be solved? And we ask them what it means to send people to intervene in faraway places. We challenge them to think about what it means for successive commanders to make claims about progress and turning corners. We ask them to think about population security and governance and nation building at the same time that we expect them to be lethal and tactically proficient. And those are real questions, and none of them lend themselves to easy answers, and none of them are satisfied by the idea that wars are lost at home, that there are such things as military victories but political defeats. And I've seen years of these discussions and briefings, and every year I leave with a feeling that I can't quite shake, that the war couldn't have been won by fighting it better. And increasingly I'm leaving with a maybe more sobering thought, which is I'm not sure it would have mattered anyway. I don't know what the world looks like if the US and its South Vietnamese allies had won the war. I don't know how the world might have looked different. Would we have a permanent base in South Vietnam, a heavily militarized DMZ there, another 50-year standoff with a communist adversary? How would it have affected our relationship with China? Would it have affected the end of the Cold War? Would it have actually reoriented American grand strategy? Would we have seen even more interventions rather than the limited retrenchment of the post-Vietnam era? Has the war in Vietnam actually forced us to re-examine the balance of US interest around the world and what we think we can do with American power? These are, of course, impossible to answer in one sense, but I am increasingly uncertain about the war's legacy on American grand strategy, and this is perhaps its greatest paradox or its greatest tragedy. There is no question that the Vietnam War fundamentally changed lives, American and Vietnamese. The tragedy of this war is unmistakable. The war radically alters American politics, the American military, the way Americans think about war and talk about war. Its cultural, political, and rhetorical ramifications are enormous. But I wonder if we don't focus on these effects to the detriment of close and critical examinations about the nature of American military power, its limits, and how American military power shapes strategic preferences in the 21st century. And we have to grapple with these questions, and until we do, I think the specter of Vietnam, the ghost of Vietnam lingers, and we will continue to operate in the realm of mythology rather than history.
That's awesome.
Well, thank you, panelists, for a very thought-provoking panel. We've got some time left for questions. I was going to start out, but Jackie posed all the questions I had on my sheet here. So what we would like to do, ladies and gentlemen, again, please, if you have a question, wait for the microphone. Hold the microphone close enough so we can be heard. I'll try and recognize you so I can send it to the appropriate panel member. First question. Sir.
I've got a comment. I was assigned to MACV 66, 67, and one on the politics. Yes, it was political. The Saigon government at that time was corrupt. And as far as Westmoreland, I'm not defending him, but when I was in I Corps, that was our area, and when we got reports, which was basically the 3rd Marine Division, and they're taking casualties at a great number, when we sent the information down to Saigon, the letters got intercepted. Westmoreland was being told our casualties were light, that the enemy was sustaining heavy losses. And a lot of times, this was not the case. So it was political on both fronts, from the Vietnamese and from us.
Okay. Greg, would you like to take that on? It really sounds like, sir, your question is about accuracy of reporting so that the senior commander can make good strategic judgments.
I think it's an important point. I want to be careful, though, of just simply suggesting that the Saigon government failed just because it was corrupt. I think there's far more complexity to that statement that we need to embrace. That this is an important struggle for the South Vietnamese and the Saigon leadership about, again, what I mentioned in my comments about what it means to be Vietnamese, and even that question is difficult. Does Vietnamese mean South Vietnamese? Is South Vietnamese different than being Vietnamese? So I want to be careful about just laying the problem or the failure of the American war in Vietnam on a corrupt Saigon government, because I think that's difficult. And I think clearly in all wars that are both political and military, gaining accurate intelligence is incredibly difficult. I think throughout the American experience in Vietnam, defining key terms was incredibly difficult. This was a war about security. What does secure mean? This is a war about governmental control. What does control really mean? And trying to gain accurate intelligence on those key definitions, security, control, pacification, body counts, all of these critical terms that were so important to measuring progress and effectiveness in Vietnam I think those definitions themselves were contested, and because those definitions were contested, it was even more difficult to gain accurate intelligence on how well the war was progressing.
Great. Next question. Sir.
You said in your in the case study that at the War College that what you gave your students was how would they develop a military strategy based on the political parameters of the time. What is your response to the fact that it was an unwinnable war because the political parameters lacked a coherent national strategy?
Sure. No, I think this is a really important piece, which is the relationship between military strategy and the national sort of political objectives has to be one that's under constant negotiation. I think one of the difficulties military students, again, and I'm teaching 05s and 06s right now, they very badly want clear political objectives, right? They had one here. Whether or not that was an attainable objective, whether or not that was a reasonable objective to pursue, I think is a somewhat different question. One of the things I always ask to sort of follow up is at what point should political objectives change, right? At what point in the midst of fighting a war, in the midst of prosecuting a war, should those political objectives change? Do I think the sort of unwinnable war thesis tends to go something like it was not winnable at an acceptable risk and cost, right? We could have done more, but it has ramifications if you leave it elsewhere. And the point that I'm coming to more and more now is that may have been the correct political objective, and it may not have been achievable. And so you get stuck in the middle of a conflict where doing something is required. And what that something is might change over time. It might, and it may not lead to the fulfillment of those political objectives. Maybe the best you get is baby steps along the way. Maybe the best you get is the situation that we ended up with. I don't know, and I think those are uncomfortable questions to ask. But the general idea that it's a sort of all or nothing proposition is one that I'm increasingly sort of uncomfortable with, I guess.
Mark or Greg, would you like to care to comment?
I'll wait for the next one.
Okay. All right. Sir.
How do we build trust from our military in our political decisions? In the hindsight of history of Vietnam, we know that President Johnson and Secretary McNamara made many knee-jerk decisions that cost thousands and thousands of lives. How does the military build that trust that our current or past political leaders are making the right and proper, precise political decisions?
Well, I'll comment on that. So I think Johnson has been criticized, and rightly, for being dishonest with the American people about Vietnam on repeated occasions. So Tonkin Gulf is a good example in terms of how that was misrepresented to the American people. And when he talks when he talks about how we're not going to send American boys to Vietnam in 1964, and then in '65 he prevaricates about sending U.S. troops. And so I think that Johnson did unfortunately squander the credibility of the presidency. McNamara was also party to that, which someone had asked about McNamara. And I think McNamara's apologies in his books are to some extent attempts to him to cover his tracks. I think he also bears a lot of responsibility. And I would just say, I don't think the military needs to be responsible for sort of restoring or even can restore the credibility that was lost in that fashion. It's ultimately the politicians' responsibility to maintain that trust. And the military obviously has an important role to play in terms of behaving properly, and I think in general, the military did acquit itself well. I don't buy this argument that there was My Lai's happening all over the place, which is something that's lately been alleged. But I think fundamentally it's a question of presidential leadership that, and if the presidential leadership is that far off, there's not much the military can do.
I would add one thing, though, that strategic dialogue, as Jackie said, that has to continue to occur, that military officers obviously do have a responsibility, and that's being honest about what's capable with the use of military force. So I think, again, one of the perspectives to be gained by studying this is that strategic dialogue, especially at the grand strategy level that Jackie talked about, has to be constant, but it also has to be honest. And I think military officers, especially in senior positions, can't overpromise what they're capable of delivering when it comes to military force in achieving political objectives.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Good morning. So we talked a little bit about the synchronization of political and military goals throughout the Vietnam War and Westmoreland's strategy. But did any of this actually matter when you look at the White House and how insulated they were? It seems that Johnson took advice primarily from McNamara. And even after McNamara's visit to Vietnam, he was still giving a very rosy picture of the war. So could Westmoreland have done anything differently in light of how insulated President Johnson and Robert McNamara were?
My assessment, and I don't know if I agree with Jackie here, is that I don't know if there could have been anything done differently. But I also think we need to be careful about this insulation argument that my reading of memorandum back from MACV through the Pacific Command into the Joint Chiefs of Staff and then into the White House ultimately, that there's really two McNamaras and two Westmorelands. There's a public McNamara and a private McNamara. There's a public Westmoreland and a private Westmoreland. And those private conversations are pretty darn honest. When Westmoreland meets the President and the Secretary of Defense in the White House when he comes home a number of times while the war is ongoing, his public comments are very, very different than they are inside the White House when it's just the President and senior leadership. McNamara, I think, is the same way. We can find fault with him, as Mark alluded to, in terms of being more honest publicly. But in private, when you look at some of the memoranda that both Westmoreland and the Secretary of Defense are giving the President, they're brutally honest. I mean, McNamara, a number of memoranda as early as 1966 and certainly as 1967 are pretty forthright in terms of the possibility of what's achievable here. So one of the things I think we all need to consider as citizens as we're trying to be engaged with discussions on war is how honest the dialogue that we're hearing is, and how that might be different than the inside conversations that are happening within official channels.
And I'll just add that Joint Chiefs from early on were pushing policies that were more aggressive, such as bombing more quickly, going into Laos. And from pretty early on, Johnson made clear that he did not have a high opinion of his generals. I think he had a certain inherent bias against the military. And so he would, in general, always side with his civilians. Now, very late in his presidency, as McNamara is out, it shifts a little bit, but I think for most of his presidency, it's pretty clear that he just did not think that the military were the people to listen to.
Yeah, I would just add that it goes back to the previous question too. One of the definitions of strategy that I am playing with and that I like a lot is that strategy is the dialogue between the desirable and the possible. That the desirable ought to inform what is possible in terms of acquisitions and force structure, but also that what is possible is going to inform what is desirable. And it really gets to this question of communication and trust as public versus private. And this becomes more and more complicated as media technologies change, as access changes, as we have, public, again, this sort of public and private persona. But my own reading is close to Greg's, which is that in private, these are pretty frank conversations, but the evolution happens in sort of slower and maybe more deliberate ways than we're sometimes willing to give it credit for.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's please give our panelists a great hand. I'd like to thank our panelists, an excellent panel that hit on all of the key controversies that matter in the strategic realm and have given us a lot to think about, and Dr. Whitt helping us reframe that relationship of what happens here domestically in turning out policy and strategy. So I'd like to thank you all for coming today and taking time. On behalf of the superintendent, the staff and faculty, and the Corps of Cadets, thank you for coming and sharing. Please accept this small token of our appreciation.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now take another 10-minute break or so, and we'll re-adjourn in the Hall of Valor. Please seat yourself around the table, and we'll begin our next panel at 10:45.
Just kind of work naturally.
Super. 4 points. It was like, uh-oh, there goes my first 3 points.